as the flag shows. Um, I like history. I like reading, and I've been collecting this a series of Second World War books about Second World War, of course. So there are maybe 34 of them, and I'm lucky enough to collect all of them. I mostly just go to when I go to a country town or something like that, I would go to the antique stores, and sometime I can pick some of them up. And I also get lots of them as birthday presents or Christmas present from my in-laws, because they also know I'm really into this set of books. So now, so far I have already read maybe one quarter of them, and I was thinking, what the heck? Why don't I just read it online? And English is not my first language. I can talk with my wife, all right, but let's just say I get a lot room for improvements, and I would enjoy reading this sort of books out loud, and hope this can also help my improve my ability of impression. So let's start. So this book called World in the War in the Outposts. Um, it's focused on it's focusing on books. It's focusing on wars. That's all like what happened during Second World War in areas that people usually don't talk about, such as Madagascar, Iceland, Middle East, those sort of places. Let me just adjust the camera angles so I can just, show the books. It's not that good. Let me just turn this around. Better this way. Yeah, I mean it's probably not clear enough for everyone to see the words, but there are some really good pictures in these books, and I would like to show them all. Yeah, so this series of books are pretty old. Some of them came out in the 1970s, some of them came out in the 80s. But they're really good, and I kind of like the art styles of this kind of front and the editing. Yeah, so let's start. Silhouetted against the late night sun, a lone U.S. soldier walks guard along a barbed wire barricade protecting the harbor at Camp Logarnik, Iceland. Iceland was one of countless outposts where Allied troops manned support bases or fought bitter campaigns on the fringe of the major combat zones. So here we go, we got a map here. So the description is the supply lines used by the Allies in the World War II were chosen to avoid major combat zones and the territories conquered by the Axis powers. Ceilings in blue, following chains of support bases curved around Africa to Egypt, the Middle East, India, and Burma, circled Scandinavia to Soviet ports, and veered across the Pacific to Siberia, New Zealand, and Australia. Air cargo routes in red zigzagged to islands and across safe land areas where airstrips were built for refueling stops. So you can see the publisher is Timelife Books. So you see, typically in this series of books, some chapters there are chapters and there are picture essays. So picture essays are basically just like a chapter, but mostly are just really good photos or pictures. And I would assume the first one is a picture ISIS manning the Atlantic front. The description says on Belmy, Burma, American troops are inspected by the British governor in November of 1941. This base placed U.S. forces 600 miles out in the Atlantic. Of Okay, let me just adjust my desktop. An aggressive defense of the Americans. So here is apparently a map of Atlantic Ocean, and Bermuda is here. The United States advanced its pre-war Atlantic defenses in 3 stages, expanding old bases, red dots. So that's this one, this one, and this one. Leasing British bases, gray squares. I don't think any of you can see them. So it's basically the Bermuda, Bahama Islands, and some of the islands in the Caribbean area. Acquiring outposts, black crosses. Yes, here. So there are some ports in Brazil. In Brazil and in Danish territories, which means Greenland and Iceland. An aggressive defense of the Americans. When the United States declared war on the Axis power in December 1941, one of its few military assets was a picket line of strategic bases in the Atlantic. These bases greatly enhanced the range of U.S. naval and air patrols, and they grew more important as Germany broadened its U-boat war. The Army troops manned the outposts had little to do but sit and wait, yet their presence forestalled any German attempt to advance westward from occupied Europe. The architect of the U.S. Atlantic Defense System was President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who pressed his base-building plans despite stiff opposition at home. His first effort began on September 6, 1939, 3 days after the start of World War II, was to strengthen the 3 weak U.S. bases in the Atlantic, the naval enclave in Cuba's Guantanamo Bay, a radio and hydrographic station on Puerto Rico, and the Panama Canal, which was said by the commander, vulnerable to attack at any time. FDR also created a neutrality patrol to sweep a 300-mile wide belt of coastal waters reaching from northern Canada to South America. Then, in September 1940, Roosevelt scored a major defensive triumph. He arranged a pact with Britain and gave the United States 99 years leases to build and maintain bases on the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Antigua, Trinidad, and British Guiana. In return, the hard-pressed Royal Navy got 50 overaged overage destroyers of a type that the States has been selling for scrap at $5,000 each. It was, said FDR, the most important action for American defense since the 1803 Louisiana Purchases. The British, in dire need of warships, were so pleased that Prime Minister Winston Churchill threw in Newfoundland and Bermuda as bonus. The land lease agreement alarmed many conservative Americans. The New York Daily News declared the United States has one foot in the war and the other on a banana peel. The Roosevelt made even broader arrangements for bases in Danish Greenland and Iceland. He explained that his strategy was to move in before the enemy did. If you hold your fire until you see the whites of his eyes, you will never know what hit you. And this picture is delivering a land-leased destroyer at Halifax, Nova Scotia. American sailors explained the peculiarities of a 4-inch gun to the ship's Royal Navy crewmen. So apparently those destroyers American gave to British were just very old and extremely uncomfortable. But British was at a really bad state at that point. Their cargo ships got sunk left and right by the U-boats, and you gotta get your boat, and yeah. Warships of the U.S. fleet filled the canal zone's crowded Balboa Harbor during the naval annual springtime maneuvers. So I would assume this is Panama. Old Navy. So here, Old Navy biplanes line Michaela Hill Field, one of two naval airfields under construction at Guantanamo Bay in 1940. And this one looks like a really old naval fort. In the shade of a stone archway, a U.S. soldier stands guard atop the steep ramp entrance to 17th century Fort San Cristobal in San Juan, Puerto Rico. New muscle for old bases. With Roosevelt's encouragement, the U.S. Congress in June of 1939 appropriated $50 million to strengthen the defense of the Panama Canal and outlying bases. In Panama, the Navy built new depots and barricades, enlarged its submarine bases, and modernized air and radio stations. The Army planted anti-aircraft guns and batteries of searchlights in clearings in the jungle and increased its Panama troops' strength from 12,000 to 28,000. The influx of GIs so far outstripped the construction of barricades that for a time the men were quartered in the hangars of a local airfield. To guard the canal's eastern Caribbean approaches, the Army cleared a cow pasture at the northwestern tip of Puerto Rico and within 2 months built the Point Borinquin Air Base for nine long-range B-17s. The Navy constructed another Puerto Rican airfield on a drained portion of the San Juan Harbor, and at Cuba's Guantanamo Bay, four new installations were built in 1940: two airfields, a fuel depot, and a facility for 2,000 Marines. By December 1941, U.S. defenses in the Panama Canal Zone and the Caribbean were manned by 58,000 troops. Oh, this doesn't look like tropical. This looks like Canada or something. Monitoring signals from a radio direction finder, two soldiers based on Newfoundland track ships and planes traveling along the Atlantic convoy routes. Immediately after Roosevelt concluded his 1940 destroyer deal with Great Britain, Army and Navy planners sent American contractors to build airstrips, docks, and barricades in the 8 British territories. In several colonies, the inhabitants had never before seen such hectic activity. The Bermudians, who had banned automobiles to preserve the tranquility of their islands, reconciled themselves sadly to the great American trucks that rumbled persistently along their narrow roads, with supplies for an airfield and a naval base. Even before the new facility were finished, the garrison began arriving. In late January 1941, 1,000 U.S. soldiers landed at St. John's, Newfoundland. They were the first U.S. troops to set foot on foreign soil in World War II. By autumn 1941, all 8 bases were operational. U.S. air and sea patrols from Newfoundland protected land-lease convoys part of the way to Britain and the North Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Patrols based at Trinidad, British Guiana, and Bermuda guarded the freighters, bringing wells and bauxite to be refined into aluminum from South America to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Only 5 Allied merchant ships were sunk off the North American coast before the United States entered the war. I can make the angle better. Be hard. Alright, let me just take this away. That's better. Yeah, that's much better. Camouflaged by clumps of palm fronds. Bermuda ammunition magazines is patrolled by a lone guard from U.S. Naval Station. Army engineers on Trinidad survey a section of tropical forest Well, begin construction on one of the island's three U.S. airfields. At Brazil's Bahia airport, on the route to Africa, local workers plant grass with hose to cut down on dust between newly completed runways. Hand tools were employed in order to spare the time and the expenses of shipping earth moving equipment from the United States. Well, who need tools when the labor is cheap? U.S. Army troops in Iceland huddled in their tents, half buried by wind, uh, whipped, snow dripped. The sub-Arctic winter was so fierce that the army commander recommended limiting a tour of duty so that no one would have to endure 2 winters. But the suggestion was dropped when the United States joined the war. I think I read it on the Red Storm Rising. There's no tree on Iceland because the severe weather in the winters. I'm not sure it's real or not. In the summer of 1941, the United States advanced its line of bases far across the Atlantic and also established a military presence on the coast of Brazil at a dozen Brazilian locations. Pan American Airways, supervised by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, constructed or improved airstrips from which American built transports and bombers could be flown across the South Atlantic to British forces in North America. In the middle of September, 9 U.S. warships began operating from the Brazilian ports of Recife and Bahia, patrolling the Atlantic far to the south. In the North Atlantic, U.S. forces were sent to garrison Danish Greenland and Iceland. From bases built there, American planes patrolled the nearby convoy routes, escorting merchantmen and warning them of U-boat sightings. Edging closer to the wall, Roosevelt ordered the U.S. escort to fire back if attacked. Convoys mean shooting, he said, and shooting means war. I remember in Hearts of Iron 3, if you play as America, you can engage German Navy in the western side of Atlantic Ocean, even you are not in war with Germany. Okay, so this is the first proper chapter. Warfare at the world's end. Wonder where that is. 5 U.S. soldiers, together with a handful of local supporters and paddlers, spent 3 days in September of 1942 tracking south from the recent captured port of Tamatave on the east coast of Madagascar. So that's where it is. They traveled part of the way in dugout canoes through gloomy mangrove swamps, battling at mosquitoes and barely steering clear of crocodiles. It's kind of worldy. Finally, the little party arrived at the town of Waitemandere, headquarters of the large administrative district where the enemy was waiting. The person of Vichy France's chief district named Feline. Monsieur Feline had been warned of the British approach by the Malagasy grab, grab, grapevine and had dressed for the encounter in his best gold-braided uniform. You have, of course, some soldiers? Finlay asked the British leader. The Englishman was amused. He realized that Finlay, like several of Madagascar's Vichy officers before him, was trying to avoid a fight, yet preserve his honor. The usual charade was to pretend that even a feeble foe was an overwhelming force. Yes, he replied, we have some soldiers. Naturally, they are armed. Naturally. Automatic weapons, I presume. Tommy guns. Within minutes, the British were enjoying drinks with the district chief, and the cable was on its way to Feline's government. Waitemandere occupied at 1600 hours by British forces, armed with automatic weapons and supported by artillery. Further communication impossible. Feline. The British soldiers did not blame Feline for declining to shed blood over his outpost. Their first reaction was that the place was hardly worth winning. But one of the Englishmen sitting on the hotel veranda that night perceived a real significance in their victory. We had added an area of several hundred square miles to the British zone of occupation, he mused. We had achieved a minute fragment of history. Madagascar and the scores of remote outposts like it had taken on strategic importance. For the war that began in Europe in September 1939 had by now become the first truly worldwide conflict. Every major nation and dozens of small ones had been drawn into the struggle on either side. From the pack ice of Arctic to the peaceful shore of South America to the uninhabited atolls of the Pacific, every stretch of land and sea was a potential combat zone. In the global struggle, the territory ambitions of the aggressor quickly established the major threats. By December 1941, Hitler's Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. The Germans had engulfed most of the Europe and spilled over into North Africa. By the end of summer, the Japanese, already the occupier of much of China and still ravenous for raw materials, had swept across most of the Southwest Pacific, through Southeast Asia, and into the east reaches of the Indian Ocean. The decisive land battles of the war were won or lost in these theaters, which encompassed less than 10% of the world's land surface. The location of the primary combat zones inexorably shaped the conduct of the war throughout the rest of the world. A basic outlet strategy originated by the British called for defending the flanks of the major theaters to prevent further Axis expansion. As a result, many outpost campaigns, holding operations, preemptive strikes, and local counterattacks were mounted in the Middle East, on the islands, guarding the approaches to India and Australia. Even on the Aleutians Island extending west from Alaska's coast. In turn, the colossal task of supporting both the major combat zones and the flank campaigns spread a global uh, spread a globe guarding network of small intermediary outposts, air and naval bases, staging areas, and weather stations. By far the most important flank campaigns took place in the well-reached Middle East, and the juncture of three continents and as many major theaters. In the spring of 1941, with German forces driving into the Balkans and attacking across the Libyan desert toward Egypt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill feared that Iraq and Vichy French Syria would fall to what he called petty Air Force tourists and local revolts. The tourists were German Fifth columns who arrived wearing sports jackets and carrying identical suitcases, thus providing a forewarning of Hitler's intentions. Since German takeovers in Iraq and Syria might have forced British to abandon Egypt, the Suez Canal, and Palestine, Churchill decided that it was better to strike first than to be forced to evict and entrenched to evict an unentrenched enemy. Even after those two campaigns were fought and won, the Allies' troubles in the Middle East were not over. To nip more German subversions in the butt, and to deliver landless war material to the Soviet Union through the Persian corridor, the, the Allies made Iran another target for invasion. And 8 months later, the British invaded Madagascar to deny its ports to the Japanese submarines that were preying on Allied supply ships en route to Iran. By striking first in the Middle East, the Allies avoided the fate that befell their troops deep in the southwest Pacific and on the island. What the hell is this word? Let me check. ATHWART.
Athwart.
A sword. A sword. Sword. From side to side of. Okay. Oh shit, where am I? A sword seaways into the island Indian Ocean. There, Allied forces had to fight their flank campaigns twice. First to contain or delay the advancing Japanese, then to reclaim lost territories. The Australians' defense of Timor and 3 years later their reconquest of Borneo were classic example of each stage, and as savage as the better known battles of the main American island hopping campaigns to the north. The flank campaigns differed in detail, but common threads ran through them all. Most of the campaigns were struggle for the colonies or former colonies of Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, Belgium, and neutral Portugal. Thus, many were marked by those familiar figures of the empire: the governor nor general, the high commissioners, and the district chief, by disputes between the deposed rulers, client kings, and the allies themselves, and by the deployment of colonial levies, conscripts, empire troops, led by European officers. Where European warfare dealt in arms, wrote Joan Bagot Glob, the commander of Transjordan's Arabic Legion in the Iraq-Syrian campaign. We handled companies. Moreover, the small force engaged in flank campaigns or uh, dinerly fought with few weapons and obsolete equipment. All that was left after the Allies had outfitted their huge armies in the major theaters. Many small units made a virtue of their lack of equipment. They fought as guerrillas, unencumbered by heavy weapons. Some companies were elite units expressly trained for irregular operations. In the aggregate, hundreds of thousands of Allied men took part in the flank campaigns as combat troops or garrison soldiers, and hundreds of thousands uh, more manned the support outposts. Most of the men fought their assignments thou most of the men fought their assignments dull and trivial compared with the great battle being fought on Saipan and the beaches of Normandy. Typically, a British New World. Where is it? Typically, a British. Nice.
Subaltern.
Subaltern. A British subaltern. British subalterns stationed in Palestine laminated the feeling of fertility at being out of it. A spectacular in a safe and sun-kissed country, which the civilized world, our world, is being rocked to its foundations. And yet, duty in the outpost returned a kind of austere satisfaction to those men who, like the British soldier massing and on the veranda in Tamatave on Madagascar, realizing that their sideshow often had a considerable impact on the course of the war. Small grotesque, grotesquely ill, ill-equipped units pinned down and sometimes defeated much larger enemy forces that might have swung the balance in major battles elsewhere. A few resolute, a few resolute men in the right outpost and the right time played more important role than did whole divisions in monstrous European battles, where soldiers died by the tens of thousands and sometimes succeed only in establishing which army could better afford the sacrifice. The support bases were remote by design, proliferating along roundabouts, sea and air routes to avoid the pros of the major combat zones, but maintaining the distant fronts taxed to the limit the resources of Great Britain and the United States. Maritime power led with each extension of the war had to tie up more ships on long voyages and safeguard their passage to far-flung theaters. Britain was in particularly difficult position. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the Mediterranean became a war zone, closed to most convoys, and the ships bound for Suez, India, and beyond had to make a 12,000-mile detour. Where was I? Around Africa. The distance from England to Bombay was thus doubled, and the distance to Suez was quadrupled. During 1942 and 1943, Great Britain had more than twice as many troops overseas as the United States, and the British committed more dry cargo tonnage to the needs of their armed forces than did the Americans, 8.5 million versus 6 million tons. At the same time, Britain had to provide shipping to import food and raw materials, where the United States imported no food and fewer raw materials. The Axis domination of the Mediterranean gave new importance to the sea routes through the South Atlantic and around Africa. Routes that had lain unfurrowed since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Islands that had faded into semi-oblivion began to appear in Allied war reports. St. Helena, where Napoleon ended his days in British captivity, was used as a British naval base in the South Atlantic. Hostilities even spread to the Antarctic, where armed German merchant cruisers captured Anglo-Norwegian whalers. On many faraway islands, airstrips were cleared, from which patrol planes covered focal areas and extended surveillances into the empty reaches of the oceans. Repair shops, docks, and refueling stations were constructed from which naval units escorted troop ships and supply convoys on the route through the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean to Durban, Mombasa, Aden, Mumbai, Ceylon, and Burma. Depots, listening posts, and communication centers were built on each little-known Indian Ocean islands as uh, Mauritius, Adu Atoll, and Diego Garcia, and the Coco Islands, southwest of Sumatra, and Socotra in the Arabian Sea. Perhaps Socotra was the least known of this remote island. When the first handful of Allied personnel was ordered there in April 1942, few of the men had any idea where or even what it was. One man thought it was a ship. It was in fact an island 72 miles long, strategically situated at the entrance of the Gulf of Aden. It had been dependency of the British Empire since 1886. The exposed island was difficult to visit owing to its lack of harbors, the abundance of dangerous reefs, and the desiccating southwest winds, which blew so strongly half the year that no sailing craft could approach from the African mainland. Fishermen could not put out in their dhows to fish. Suppliers of maize from East Africa stopped. The wadis filled with sand, wells dried up, and the grass withered and turned brown. In 1943, about 10% of the Bedouin Hill people died of famine, and many who survived by stealing goats had their hands chopped off by the local Sudan's executioners. The Sultan, honoring Scotra's 19th century agreement with Britain, allowed the British to build an airstrip on his medieval island, which was cut off from the modern world without roads, electricity, sanitation, or even a doctor. Drips and drabs of Allied personnel came and went, Royal Air Force pilots and ground crews, detachments of levies from Britain's Aden Protectorate, officers and men of the Royal Netherlands Naval Air Force, companies of Somaliland Scouts, colonial troops from French West Africa, and a battalion of the 1st Punjab Regiment from India. The first British arrived, lived in caves, then in sandbag huts, and the stony north coastal plain, overlooked by the jagged spires of the central Higer mountain range. By 1943, the European presence on the islands still numbered only a dozen or so RAF men who lived at the edge of the airstrip in a single hut with a corrugated iron roof held down with wire guys. A mile or two away was encamped uh, a mile or two away was encamped a detachment of Aden Protectorate levies, commanded by a British officer and two or three British non-coms, who messed with the RAF. In May of that year, four Royal Navy radio men arrived in an Arab coaster and waded to the beach with their equipment and personnel kits. Their job was to listen for the distress signals from cargo vessels torpedoed by enemy submarines, and then transmit the ship's coordinates to Aden so that the aircraft could be sent out on rescue mission and on search and destroy operations. At first, no aircraft were regularly stationed on Socotra, and sometime 2 weeks went by without a plane landing there. But on September 27, 1943, two PBY Catalinas with Dutch crews arrived from Mombasa to make their base on the island. A, monst- a, mon- momentous, a monstrous, a momentous day, wrote one of the Royal Navy radiomen in his diary. The, the new arrivals had more than doubled the size of the European garrisons. The Dutch airmen had a shock when they saw the barren plain and the bell tents in which they would live. But they soon settled in and got on well with the British. Later, Wellington bombers and other aircraft detached from Aden used the airstrip from time to time. Socotra almost busted. The men on the island lead a free and easy life, wearing shorts and sandals, and doing what they pleased in their off-duty hours. Some visited tiny capital of Hadibu, with its white flat-roofed houses set among palm trees beyond a rugged spur of the mountains. A few became explorers, trekking off on private missions of archaeology or anthropology, or searching out such botanical oddities as marach and frankincense trees, adenine trees, cucumber trees, and dragon's blood trees shaped like umbrellas sprung inside out. Most of the men passed the time playing football and cricket on the airstrip, from which they occasionally had to drive away stray camels and swimming out into the tepid bay from a nearby sandy beach. Their diet of tinned bacon and chapatis, Indian flat bread, corned beef, and hard biscuits became monotonous, but it was bearable for the 6 to 10 months that most of the troops spent on the island. Small excitement or epic event on Socotra. 10 airmen were killed in various mishaps and buried on the cemetery hill west of the airfield. Occasionally, Survivors from torpedoed merchant ships staggered ashore from lifeboats. Two to the hulls machine gunned by Japanese submarines drifted to the island full of dead and dying men. The survivors were too shocked and weak to jettison the bodies. One of one of Socotra's Wellington bomber damaged a U-boat with depth charges, forcing it to be scuttled on the coast of British Somaliland, where the 59 survivors were captured by a naval party and a detachment of the Somaliland Camel Corps. It was hardly inspiring duty. Yet the distress calls picked up on Socotra saved many lives, and the air escorts that flew from Socotra helped to fend off submarines waiting to ambush India and the Burma-bound convoys. Those were jobs that needed doing, a useful part of the worldwide war, and the jobs were done. Yeah, let's have a look at this picture as well. What was it about? President Franklin D. Roosevelt wearing a black armband to mourn his mother's death. Here he is. Shares center stage with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the White House press conference on December 23rd, 1941. The two leaders spent the week working on plans for Anglo-American cooperations, including the establishment of the ABDA, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command to defend the outpost in the Southwest Pacific. By itself, sea transportations was not enough. Fast troop transports from Britain sailing around the Cape took from 6 to 10 weeks to reach the Middle East. Freighters took much longer, and though their pace was good enough for the steady movement of the most supplies, it was too slow for the many emergencies that arose in wartime. The lack of critically needed spare parts, radar equipment, or other high technology gears could spell disaster at the battlefronts. As a consequence, military airlines were established to transport high priority supplies, key personnel, and combat planes to Allied outposts all over the world. The British were pioneers in this aerial enterprise, but the Americans carried it to its ultimate development. The U.S. Air Transport Command, a branch of the Army Air Forces, employed 200,000 men at its peak and operated more than 3,000 aircraft over half a dozen major routes and scores of feeder lines. The ATC's first route across to the South Atlantic was set up in June 1941 and was operated until October of the following year by civilian contractors, chiefly Pan American Airways. In those early days, Only four-engine bombers and twin-engine aircraft fitted with actual fuel tanks could fly the South Atlantic non-stop, and then only via the shortest route from the coast of Brazil to the coast of West Africa. Planes setting out from West Palm Beach, Florida, where the route began, where the route began, made a series of hops down through the Caribbean and along the coast of South America, touching down in Puerto Rico, Trinidad, British Guiana, and Bahamas at the mouth of the Amazon River before reach Natal on the easternmost bulge of the Brazilian coastline. But in April 1942, a new base of great strategic importance was opened to on Ascension Island, a barren fly speck in the mid-Atlantic. This base made it possible for unmodified medium and light bombers and even some fighter planes to land for refueling and make the transatlantic trip in two stages. The pilots who flew the route memorized the 34 square mile island with a ditty. If I don't hit Ascension, my wife will get if I don't hit Ascension, my wife will get a pension. In practice, however, pilots found the island with little or no trouble, homing in on a powerful radio beam. The British had annexed the arid volcanic island in 1815 and later turned it into a coaling station for the Royal Navy. When the Americans arrived to build the air base, it contained a British cable station and a population of 165. The maximum that could be supported by the water supply, and among the facilities that had to be provided was a water desalination plant. The runway, hazily blasted out of solid rock, was left with a disconcerting hump in the middle, which pilot could not avoid without overrunning the airstrip. And there were other disadvantages. The base was labeled wide Wake Field after the large colony of wide wake terns that habitually nested on the rocky area at one end of the runway, where they posed a hazard to planes landing or taking off. At the approach of a plane, the terns rose in panic from their nests, and the dense feathery cloud in front of the aircraft threatened to break its windscreen, clog its engines, and air scoops or dent the landing edges of the wings and tail. In short, the pilots were always in imminent danger of plowing into the runway or ditching in Atlantic. The birds were unsuccessfully attacked with smoke candles and dynamite. When the Americans announced that they were bringing in more Caterpillar tractors for construction projects, the announcement inspired a mistaken tale. phalanxes of house cats were said to have been imported to eat the terns, but were themselves pounced on and eaten by the island's booby-birds, a larger and more powerful species. Several responsible publications reported the wild yarn as fact. The term hazard continued until someone sought to call in an ornithologist from the American Museum of Natural History. The turn's eggs should be removed to another location, he advised, and then the birds would not return. The army proved him right, though it impatiently destroyed 40,000 eggs in the process. From Ascension Island, the planes flew on to Assyria and Dakar on the west coast of Africa. There they joined the main British air reinforcement routes coming from London by the way of neutral Lisbon. The US bombers and the British flying boats, many of them American-made PBYs, crossed the interior of the continent to avoid the Germans on the Mediterranean coast. En route, the plane staged at a series of exotic bases: Lagos, Kano, and Maiduguri in Nigeria, Fort Lamay in French Equatorial Africa, and Sudanese outposts such as Al Guyana, Al Fasher, and Al Obeid. The eastern end of the African leg was Khartoum of Cairo. All aircraft heading east from Cairo flew to Iraq and Iran or to Aden, then to Karachi, Delhi, and Calcutta. The last leg was over the hump of Himalayas to Kunming. Where do we go? Terminal of the East India-China supply route, 14,000 miles away from Florida. A branch line from India to Australia functioned briefly in December 1941 and early January 1942, while the Americans were building islands based for a trans-Pacific route. But by January 15th, ATC planes from the US West Coast began flying the 7,800-mile run to Australia. Let's actually have a look at this section first. So this is a free French warship pulled alongside the quay in St. Paris harbor to an enthusiastic welcome by a gathering of local citizens. Dagola's cross of Lorraine flag and the French tricolor fly overhead as three St. Pierre's residents returned to their home after voting. Islanders and free French sailors come together for the Uh, what the hell is this? Like the outlines some peers and was the with the Free French movement. So this island is this island the tiny island near Canada, like belong to the French. In December 1941, St. Pierre's and no, I need to figure out how to read this. St. Peter's and so it's French.
Miquelon.
Miquelon. St. Peter's and Miquelon. Two tiny French St. Pierre's and Miquelon, two tiny French possessions of the southern coast of Newfoundland, became the center of a diplomatic embroil. embroil ah, what's all this? Right. I am your
Imbroglio.
imbroglio. Center of diplomatic imbroglio that rocked the British-American alliance. The islands were governed by Vichy, but the 44,700 inhabitants were in sympathy with General Charles de Gaulle, the Free French movement. The United States did not recognize de Gaulle. The, the State Department, which had negotiated an agreement with Vichy establishing neutrality of St. Pierre and Miquelon, feared that a free French takeover of the island would provide the Germans with a pretext for occupying and defending Vichy's possessions in North Africa and the Caribbean. Winston Churchill favored the takeover, but to placate the Americans, he extracted a promise from de Gaulle not to invade the island without Allied approval. De Gaulle immediately broke his word and ordered four Free French warships to seize the islands. On Christmas Eve, a handful of Free French sailors ousted the island's Vichy governor, then in hasty arranged a plebiscite. An overwhelming majority of the islanders endorsed de Gaulle. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was outraged. He felt betrayed by the British who welcomed de Gaulle's victory and called de Gaulle a marplot for endangering Allied plans. Hull spent 3 weeks furiously urging the British to persuade de Gaulle to withdraw from the island. His attempts succeed only in whipping up U.S. public support for the goal. Finally, the State Department backed down. Thus, the Hall later wrote, a matter that had threatened to become a whole chapter in history declined to a, to a footnote. Well, it seems the whole book is it's about footnotes. All right, I think I've read enough for tonight. Yeah, with or without people watching, I'll just keep reading this. I actually feel pretty good about this. And like when I read things in public, I feel cringe for myself because I know like my reading ability is really poor, and for many people, it's kind of torture to listen to me reading stuff. But I just hope over time, my just my ability to express myself, which include reading out loud, will improve eventually. All right, I'm signing off.